One of the important concepts in Chapter 7 that helps us understand people's demand for insurance, which in turn stems from their risk aversion, is a concept we call diminishing marginal utility. And at the root of this insight is that if we think about, well, let's establish why we care about utility. We care about utility in economics because what people are really after is their well-being. And there is some correlation between well-being and the amount of income someone earns, but it's not a particularly good correlation. It's not a particularly tight correlation. So what we're really going after is happiness. How do we measure that? We have this concept of utility. And then of course we're trying to relate changes in income to changes in happiness. That's what gets us to this important concept of diminishing marginal utility. And the key insight here is if we think about an extra $20,000 a year worth of income, if we're super rich, and I've got this picture of this fantastic yacht. I was going for one that had a helicopter on it, but I couldn't get that image to work. Anyway, this is some rich person's fantastic yacht. If you think about a super, super wealthy person, Bill Gates comes to mind, but there's plenty others around. Well, I'm not going to mention anybody closer to home. There's certain employees at Pacific University that make a lot more than I do, even just in their pension earnings, let alone their salary. Anyway, let's suppose that somebody with this fantastic yacht, I don't know how much you'd have to make to justify or just to enable you to buy a yacht and maintain a yacht of this sort. Certainly it seems like you'd need $1 million or $2 million a year even to start thinking about such a thing. Anyway, let's suppose you make $2 million a year. What the heck? If you're considering an event that would bring you in another $20,000 in a year, well, maybe you'll be able to paint some extra special stripes on your yacht, or maybe you'll be able to get a yacht that's a foot or two longer. Actually, you'd need a lot more than that probably. But that extra $20,000 isn't going to have a huge impact on your well-being. Now, on the other hand, I just found a picture of a farmer that's doing fine. But if you're of much more modest means, maybe you're making $80,000 a year, whatever, $50,000 a year. And if you have an event that gets you another $20,000 a year, well, that $20,000 is going to mean a much more considerable change in the kinds of things you're going to be able to afford to pursue your happiness. Well, we model that, of course, and we're economists, and we want to draw a graph of some sort. The graph that we use to convey this idea is the following. This is from chapter 7, which I didn't have you read. But notice what we've got here. We've got income on the x-axis, dollars per year, and we have utility, this odd concept that we economists use all the time, utils, is the units we use. You don't need to remember that. But here's where we at. Here's the graphical exposition. What I just told you. If we're at a fairly low income, let's say I naught, and we're considering what would happen to our happiness if we made delta I more, whatever this change in income is. Notice that our happiness level, represented by this vertical axis, the utils, is we're going to see a big change in utility associated with that income gain. Now, on the other hand, if we're up here, call it I1, and very creatively U1, and we get that same increase in income. Notice what happens to our happiness. It barely budges. We can't even see it, the change. So that I can't label that anymore because I'm out of room over there. This would be U1 plus delta U prime, where delta U prime is the increase in utility that results from that same income increase, but only when we're at a much higher income. This is called diminishing marginal utility. The marginal utility is your change in utility over change in income. It's the slope of this curve. And we initially see that it's quite large. There's big jumps in happiness with income when you're not making that much, but then it becomes very small, hardly any, almost zero change in happiness with a change in income. And so that's the idea. And then one last concept for the screencast. The concept of expected utility, it's actually not people's expected income that they make decisions on in order to maximize, but rather their expected utility, their expected happiness. And so notice that expected utility looks very much like expected value. It's the probability times of each outcome times not the value of the outcome, but the utility level associated with that value. And so P2 times the utility associated with the value x2, plus all the way up to Pn times the utility of the income level n. And just by way of an example, let's suppose we had three possible states, and state 1 happened with probability 0.8, 80% chance. State 2 happens with 15% chance, and state 3 happens with a 5% chance. And furthermore, I've picked these incomes somewhat deliberately. Let's suppose our income in state 1, if state 1 prevails, would be 64, but on the other hand, if state 2 happens, our income would go down to 49, and if state 3 happens, our income would fall to 25. Well, if we think of a utility function that converts income into some level of happiness, let's just think of utility as equal to the square root of income. If we think back, the square root function is one that produces this concave shape that we expect of diminishing margin, of the utility function, that this function that exhibits diminishing marginal utility. Anyway, our example, if we want to take an example, I better use a pen. EU here is the probability of state 1, 0.8, times the square root of 64. It turns out to be 8. Square root of 49 is 7. Square root of 25 is 5. So our expected utility is 0.8 times 8 plus 0.15 times 7 plus 0.05 times 5. And when you do all that math, when you do all that math, you get, when you plug those numbers into your calculator, you get 7.7. I don't know where 7.5 was coming from. 7.7. So that's expected utility. I'm more concerned that you understand the notion of diminishing marginal utility. But if you understand diminishing marginal utility and expected values, well, the jump to expected utility is a very small one indeed.